Folks, it's Wednesday, June 11th. Eric's traveling this morning, so he'll be with you all tomorrow morning on Thursday. Today, I want to start with a bit of a retrospective. We've talked about the potential this week for ridge-riding thunderstorms to re-enter the forecast. That's kind of an annual tradition. Really, it seems this time of year in June, but to have those, it kind of goes without saying. You need a ridge somewhere either of the Four Corners region, which is a common location over the south central U.S., maybe the southern plains, or at times the southeast. We're kind of seeing a signal of each of those at different times over the next 2 weeks. So we'll talk about that in this video. Also want to have kind of a broader step back look at how the drought discussion has evolved just in the last kind of 6 to 8 months. So even taking you back to the fall of 24, going into winter of 25. Eric talked similar conversation last week as well. If we just look at this 500 millibar height pattern leaving May and then into the early part of June, what is the pattern that we're kind of heading out of? Well, it was deep troughs over Alaska, brought cooler temperatures there. This stirred up some of the waters here in the North Pacific. We'll talk about that. We saw ridging build into the Northwest, heat advisories, extreme heat watches, and then this general troughiness over the eastern U.S. And that has allowed a crop to emerge in mid-May to relatively cool temperatures. Not cool by, spring or winter standards, but cool enough to, I think, be seen in some of these crop stands here. And then this kind of persistent story. This continues today with these cutoff lows sneaking through the middle part of the country. If we look at the last 15 days of temperature departures, it paints that similar picture, right? Cooler temperatures over the Midwest, kind of pining for, even high 80s in some of these areas here. We're going to get that here at the end of this week. We'll look at that as well, but the heat has really been largely out west. If we look at the last 2 weeks of precipitation, there has been plenty of it. We've talked about this story kind of nonstop over the last, 15, 30, 40, 60 days here, really spring into early summer, just how much precipitation has fallen in areas of the Mid-South, the Southern Plains, the Southern High Plains as well. We are not lacking for moisture in this area here, and those kind of big drought areas to the north saw drought build in further to the south before them. That is one way that our drought discussion has updated this year to account for just how much moisture is now sitting over, frankly, the continental U.S. Now, I did mention those waters in the Northeast Pacific, because of that persistent trophy here, some of the low pressure systems west of British Columbia, that stirs up the sea surface. When it does that, it allows some cooler water to upwell. So over the last 7 days, that's what this map is showing us, we've seen water temperatures cool off in this area here. That's also one of those kind of key components to that drought risk that we watch in May to June. When these water temperatures go cold quickly in May and June, we typically see heat and drought risk peak in the central U.S. Now, the good news here is we look at those absolute sea surface temperature anomalies, not how they've changed over the last 7 days, just what temperature are they at now relative to climatological averages, and we're warm, if anything, still in the Northeast Pacific. So we've cooled off a little bit. I wouldn't say it's alarming now, but it is something to keep an eye on, especially with how much upwelling we've seen off the coast of Oregon. You can see how cold those waters are. Now, this is one way to kind of picture those anomalies. One way we can also calculate them is how they differ from their neighbors. And what I mean by that is how warm are the waters here, not relative to their historical average, but relative to everywhere else on the globe. And if we do that, see a little bit of a different pattern. And what I mean by that is we now see that the Northeast Pacific is maybe a little bit cooler than we thought. Again, relative to the rest of the globe, we see this general East Pacific La Nina signature. Now, we're out of La Nina officially by the Climate Prediction Center standards, but we can still see that kind of remnant signature to it. And then I will say, whenever I see this kind of blue horseshoe, and let me draw that here slowly, around the East Pacific, up into the Northeast Pacific, and then around all the way over toward Japan, that tends to be drought risk as well, that we see with correlations over the central U.S. It is not a home run. It just tends to pop up more often than not in some of those drought years, and that's why it's worth mentioning. Now, is there a difference between these two maps? And that is one more telling than the other. The fact that I can't quite make out that same signature on the absolute anomalies versus history versus the ones relative to the global mean, I don't have an answer to that, frankly, not here this morning. At times we see this kind of global relative anomaly play a role in the hurricane season. Other times it doesn't. It's just the inexact nature of the science here. Another piece to that drought risk was the fall of 2024. If I take you back to the USDA Drought Monitor, this is the end of October here. See how dry we were. The entire Mississippi River watershed, save for parts of the Mississippi River here in eastern Arkansas, we're in some form of drought classification, if not abnormally dry. And we found, again, in the next growing season, that is almost 9 months later, we tended to see drought risk rear its head again because the subsoil has a memory, right? It has a sense of that lack of moisture and allows the ground to heat up quicker. Those evaporative rates can increase the dryness of the soils in the following year, and drought can reemerge. That was a concern this year for a time over some of these counties here. That holds true no longer, save for maybe a few areas here over the northern plains, which has seen some rainfall here recently, and then kind of as a spoiler is getting rain in the forecast. So we've checked a few boxes, right? I told you about the Northeast Pacific has cooled off a little bit. It is perhaps cool relative to the global mean. We see this remnant La Nina signature. That holds true with increasing drought risk, but we've kind of lost the soil moisture piece to it, and that is a critical one. We're able now over the next 2 months to recycle a lot of soil moisture back into the air, into the clouds, and into precipitation events. It's going to be that much harder to build in widespread drought over the middle part of the country, given that discussion. Now, is regional drought still on the table? Maybe similar to what we saw last year in Ohio and portions of West Virginia happening or occurring somewhere else in the Midwest? Absolutely. In fact, I would say the chances for that just July and August are more increased than they are in a given year, considering some of the background state of the atmosphere and the sea surface temperatures. Something we've also seen this year has been this momentum discussion. So we've had this lack of momentum this year. We were concerned, Eric and I mentioned this a number of times, and frankly, it wasn't the most correct forecast, that because of this lack of momentum, we were likely to see precipitation deficits build up in the middle part of the country. And that concerned us given all those other kind of background check marks that I just talked about. But it didn't happen because of all those cutoff lows that just keep sneaking through. Enough of them even made their way up into the Midwest to keep these kind of just-in-time rains going. So I mentioned some of the areas of drought concern over I-80 this year, but each one of those counties has had rainfall. You're not going to find a big plateau and there's accumulated precipitations for the year-to-date map because we've had rain. It just hasn't been quite enough in some areas relative to average. That's the only way you can kind of highlight those deficits at this point. If I kind of catch us up to present day here, looking at the upper level winds as this morning, I want to mention, if you look here, there's this subtropical ridge that I've been talking about recently, and it's kind of connected to this tropical storm activity here in the Eastern Pacific. We're going to talk about that at the end of the video. We also see that cutoff low, again, continuing here, broken record-like over the southern plains. This is over Texas. This will bring a flooding component and concern today to the eastern portion of that state. But if you look closely over the continent of North America here, notice the flow has some kinks in it, but it is largely forming a weak ridge now over the middle part of the country. So with the subtropical ridge all the way over here, here's our Bermuda high. We're able to build in a weak ridge here. And around that, we're starting to see, we see these little waves here. We're seeing the signature of those ridge riding thunderstorms, and we're going to see some of those just here today on Wednesday. If we look at the radar mosaic here this morning, just looking at the whole continental U.S., you can kind of see, even in these kind of lingering showers from overnight cloud debris and whatnot, that general flow around that weak ridge. Of course, in Texas, another morning of this kind of squall line development through the southern portions of the state. Unfortunately, these same counties here are likely to receive just storm after storm here today, maybe even to tomorrow as well. All hazards map shows that flood watch here for East Texas. It's probably our greatest concern looking at the all hazards map this morning that is otherwise pretty quiet across the continental U.S. Look at the Storm Prediction Center outlooks over the next 3 days. Those are those top three graphs here. I showed this kind of same view yesterday. See, the Storm Prediction Center has highlighted a slight risk here in portions of East Texas. My concern is far more related to the flooding. So at the bottom grid here, you can see the excessive rainfall outlook, again, for Wednesday with that moderate risk here. If we look at the upper Midwest, you can see some of those ridge riding storms here, not expected to be particularly severe, but the Storm Prediction Center has highlighted this area here over Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, and then over into the upper Midwest for storms today. Those continue tomorrow in portions of the northern plains. Fortunately, seeing continued thunderstorm potential tomorrow in East Texas, and then that slight risk for excessive rainfall continuing there. That activity actually pushes up on Friday into portions, of the Mid-South, Arkansas included. And we see some severe thunderstorm risk exit more over toward the Continental Divide and the counties east of there in Nebraska and into Kansas as well. We just look at the simulated HRRR forecast. I'm going to take this quickly through today and see East Texas, all the storms expected to continue there through the lunch hour and then potentially redeveloping behind that over the same area, right? So there's that moderate risk for flooding that we'll have to keep a close eye on today. Around midnight tonight, we see better storm coverage across this narrow band here, southern Minnesota, northern Iowa. You saw how narrow that risk area was from the Storm Prediction Center. I'm going to take this forecast back. You can actually see some of these storms develop today in eastern South Dakota. This is around lunchtime, then I'll just take it over the next 12 hours that I reversed it through northern Iowa, now into Wisconsin here overnight. And then activity moving a little bit north tomorrow. So some of these storms, again, moving central South Dakota toward the east. This takes us out to 1 p.m. after lunch tomorrow on Thursday. And unfortunately, continued rainfall in this area. Now, to go out further than that, we'll have to jump over to the 3-kilometer NAM forecast. I'm going to drag that forecast. Let's take it to 2 p.m. Thursday. Some of this activity shifted further north than where it will be today on Wednesday afternoon. over portions of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then seeing this upper level low now lift up into the mid-south here, bringing rainfall to Oklahoma and states just to the east of that as well. I'm going to jump over now, the third kind of relay handoff here to the ECMWF on Friday morning. Again, there's that precipitation over portions of the mid-south on Friday. Storms and showers over Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. This is Friday morning. Friday evening, we've seen this kind of consolidate with more widespread precipitation across the eastern part of the country here, and waiting to see potential development, potentially severe here along areas east of the Continental Divide. Let's take this forecast into Saturday. See additional Midwest thunderstorm development that pushes east on Saturday evening. And then again, just kind of waiting and watching for some ridge riding thunderstorm activity over the central and northern plains. This continues on Sunday afternoon. See some of this now Monday afternoon. That activity continuing into the overnight hours, early Tuesday, now well out into next week. And again, just kind of this parade of thunderstorms around the periphery of that ridge. Another way we can kind of view that ridge here, if we just try to make this 500 millibar roticity map valid as about 7 a.m. and around the recording of this video, there's that upper level low. And this is not a big, strong, June ridge. It's very subtle. You can see that subtle ridge there. But these little short waves that sneak through are our precipitation makers each day. So I'm going to take this loop forward in the forecast. You can see these as these come off the Continental Divide. This one here Thursday morning comes through Thursday afternoon. Each one of these, of course, this will be producing widespread precipitation all the while, but each little wave that you can see coming over there now, that one came through. This is Saturday 1 a.m., but it came through the Continental Divide earlier on Friday afternoon and prompting that severe weather threat. Maybe a little bit of break, but going into Sunday, there's some more. Tuesday, I should say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then by the middle of next week, you start to see some weakness in the flow. That ridge that was weakly here has started to split over areas of the eastern Pacific. We see a little bit of a signature here over the southeast, and that's kind of where the forecast I think is going next week. So plenty of rain chances and thunderstorm chances over this wide corridor here. That cutoff low leaving this area with good precipitation chances. But as we get into next week and the split ridge signature starts to pop up, I'm waiting to see if we see a dominant ridge build in out of the southeast, because that's going to warm up the forecast even more for portions of the middle part of the country. So we go into Thursday afternoon, well out into the forecast at this point, out beyond a week, we do start to see that southern U.S., maybe even southeast ridge signature build in. But all the while, we're still seeing that flow over the top and the potential for thunderstorms in this area here. If we look at the WPC, their forecasted precipitation outlook, this is over the next 7 days. Again, you can see just the amount of moisture expected in this area and this area here, and this kind of forming this wedge or this triangle, if you will. And that's leaving an area here of some concern. Same area that we've talked about, right? I feel like a broken record at this point, calling it the I-80, kind of dry area, the I-80 drought with some of the drought classifications remaining in D1. But we'll have to watch this area here to see who misses out, to see how many of these kind of dry pockets end up there. And this is only taking us out to Wednesday. Remember, those precipitation chances continue over this area, likely into next week as well. So if I look at the 10-day outlook from the ECMWF, just all the precipitation anomalies there. See that ridge riding thunderstorm signature all the way up into the Canadian prairie here over the eastern U.S., but we still see that kind of ridge, or wedge, I should say, anywhere from western Oklahoma through Nebraska into Iowa. These areas and counties likely receive rain. It's just not nearly as much as some of these other areas here. Again, that just tends to be the story that we've seen this year. For the temperature conversation, if we look over the next 5 days from the ECMWF, while this ridge is weak, we're not seeing widespread warmth. It is going to be warmer over the next few days here in the middle part of the country, getting up into the high 80s, maybe and cracking 90 here Thursday and Friday over portions of the Midwest, not underneath some of the stronger rainfall. But if I take this into next week, with that ridge trying to redouble back into the southeast, get a little bit stronger here, we're seeing more widespread warm signatures across the middle part of the country up into Canada as well. In fact, if I take the forecast from the ECMWF all the way out to next Friday, understand that's kind of a 8 to 9 day forecast at this point. Widespread 90-degree temperatures over a middle part of the country. Now, these modeled 2-meter temperatures, we can never take these as gospel, but it does highlight the risk for increased temperatures here. See Florida getting up near triple digits. Not sure I believe that right now. That just highlights how strong the ECMWF is bringing that ridge into that area. If we look at the AFS as a comparison, I'm going to take this forecast through Thursday. Now we're into Friday. Saturday, you can see that ridge strengthening here this weekend across the central part of the country. It struggles to build into the southern plains. We talked about why that is yesterday with all the moisture that we've seen there. But ridge riding thunderstorms coming around this ridge here as it pushes into the four corners by Monday. Tuesday, we see this weakening. better precipitation chances through the middle part of next week, and then the split where we see a piece of it over the southeast, another piece of it over the southwest here. And then the ECMWF consolidates those maybe more so over the south central or the southeastern U.S. But again, this is a great signature for ridge riding thunderstorms to come over the top here from the AFS. Now, one reason that we saw that weakness, I'm going to take you back to Tuesday and Wednesday, is likely additional hurricane development out of the eastern Pacific, maybe tropical storm as well. Those tend to pull those ridges back to the west. We've seen that at times this June. That allows this weakness to get in between. Rainfall likely along that trough here as it comes through Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, and also allows some ridging to develop over the southeast. Look at the National Hurricane Center. They have taken Barbara off the map as a post-tropical system. Cosme is still spinning here as a tropical storm, but it's really lost sort of any kind of material thunderstorms around it. Next storm would be Delilah to the east of that, and maybe even a 20% chance of formation after that. And so as these storms continue to form and move to the west over the next 7 to 10 days, that ridging tends to split. That allows ridging to grow over the southeast, move some of that subtropical ridging over the eastern Pacific, and allows troughing to get into the middle part of the country, kind of disrupting the pattern. It's been a reliable way to unfortunately keep precipitation in that part of the country as well. We jump over and look at the East Pacific, just the thunderstorm development here. If I told you to point at where the tropical storms are, just looking at the infrared satellite imagery here, I think you'd struggle. I mean, there's just no organized development at this point. You can see this area is much more organized in terms of tropical storms. Highlighted that area in red from the National Hurricane Center, and this kind of weaker area they've highlighted for potential development over the next 7 days as well. If we look at this from the ECMWF ENS rather than the AIFS, I'm going to take this forecast in through the weekend. We see that ridge continue to develop here across the middle part of the country. Ridge riding thunderstorms coming around it this weekend. But by early next week, now Monday, June 16th, we see that splitting. There's that split we talked about due to that potential tropical system development. It's just off the screen here. But one piece of it there, one piece over the southeast. Rain chances return to the middle part of the country in the southern plains early next week. But by Wednesday and now Thursday, all the way out to June 19th, we can see something more, again, of this kind of southeast ridge signature. This would build more heat potential into those same areas we talked about being behind: Ohio, parts of West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, more heat into the Midwest. But given that I don't see kind of this big blocking trough here, I don't see an omega block or a Rex block or anything like that. We still see the somewhat flat ridge signature. We have this nice, we call these kind of kickers here in the northwest to bring thunderstorms and those short waves around. And this, to me, this ECMWF ENS forecast would be very wet over portions of both the upper Midwest, the Midwest, and given that activity, that weaker portion of the flow here over the middle of the week coming through the southern plains. I mean, this is just a wet June signature for the eastern part of the country. If we look at the 8 to 14 day outlook from the ENS, we see that here. So the southern plains stay wet, Midwest and the Mid-South stay wet, all the way through the Canadian Prairie. There is this, again, this kind of almost wedge we'll have to keep an eye on here over the western plains, the western central plains. And then as that southeast ridge potentially develops next week, looking at potential heat and dry conditions over Florida. We saw how hot the ECMWF forecast was trying to make that there at the end of next week. Another way we can kind of visualize this, we're looking at the total probability. I'm going to take this forecast at the beginning here from the ECMWF ensemble of receiving less than a half inch. So I'm just going to take this forecast all the way out here. We'll go through this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and I'll take it through the end of Sunday here. And so again, that wedge shows up nicely all the way kind of pointed at Chicago here. So thunderstorm activity expected across the upper Midwest, starting here in the southern plains, inching into the Mid-South, and then spreading across the eastern U.S. And kind of following along that, we see that potential wedge of less than average rainfall develop over portions of the central plains, then extending through Iowa. But those precipitation chances increase next week. Remember that weakness in the flow, that troughing coming across, helping to decrease those probabilities. And then near the end of next week, the ECMWF ENS, right, that was when we had that southeastern ridge, storms coming around that, decreasing the probabilities again of receiving less than a half inch out through the next kind of 10 days here. There is that chance. In fact, if I take this forecast back to the end of next week, right, some of these values are around 20 to 30%. So if that were to occur, again, going into the end of June, this area is going to be highlighted again for some of those drought classifications being of concern. But I think enough chances here with those ridge riding thunderstorms, those tend to lay down boundaries. Those can be harder to predict from the models. They can reform in the morning, bring some thunderstorms over, and it's an easy way to get a quick inch or two of rainfall that might not even be in the forecast. Look to the 6 to 10 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. You can see, again, that general ridging here. It's not, widespread, 80 to 90% contours of above average temperatures, but it's getting on the higher side. It's different from what we've seen in early summer here. If we jump over and look at the same time period, 6 to 10 day forecast, but for precipitation, again, widespread precipitation chances. They even have that wedge contoured and slightly above average chances for rainfall. Drier conditions over the southeast, portions of Florida, the Intermountain West, and then let's jump over and look at the 8 to 14 day outlook. And again, you can kind of see that potential of that ridging still over the central U.S., but largely anchored over the southeast and Florida, getting out into the end of next week. This is June 18th through the 24th. And looking at the precipitation chances, again, pretty similar to what we saw with that 6 to 10 day outlook, with widespread precipitation chances over the middle part of the country, the northern plains, upper Midwest, continuing in the southern plains, potentially due to that Central American gyre that's starting to inch its way further to the north toward the continental U.S., and then below average over the western U.S. as well during this time period. Climate Prediction Center has also highlighted the Midwest for increased temperature risk. This is just a slight risk for now, but this is again out at the end of next week with that ridging developing over the southeastern U.S. and then pushing potentially into the central U.S. If we look at the same precipitation risk, despite the heat, right, mentioned that ridge potential wasn't terribly too strong. So with those ridge riding thunderstorms, actually this area here that's been highlighted next week for increased precipitation as well. So we're not seeing this ridge kind of translate quickly into widespread drought risk. Another way we can kind of forecast this out in the future, Eric and I often talk about this Bermuda high and where that's going to be positioned. This is just a different way of almost looking at the same forecast. So these are kind of ridge riding thunderstorms where we're going to see the heat or dryness built in. We used kind of the Bermuda high as a proxy for that. So what I'm looking at on a map like this is the sea level pressure anomaly. This is from the ECMWF ensemble, the same map we were looking at the precipitation anomalies and the 500 millibar height anomalies. Well, we see a strong North Pacific high here. We see a strong Bermuda high here off the east coast of the U.S. What that tends to do over the middle part of the country, it almost kind of squeezes your area of low pressure right here over the middle part of the continent. And low pressure systems tend to bring precipitation and rainfall. It's not a coincidence then that we're expecting rainfall over this area here and this area here today. Now, as I take that forecast forward into this weekend, still see that high here, Bermuda high, continuing a little bit stronger than average. And we continue the precipitation chances over the middle part of the country. It's going to Monday and Tuesday of next week. You can see that high here starting to shift away a little bit on Wednesday. So the 18th, Bermuda high starting to weaken a bit as well. We're seeing more broad low pressure system fill into the middle part of the country here, but it hasn't left, right? This Pacific high and the Bermuda high. It's maybe a little bit closer to average at this point. As I take it out further, notice as I go from Tuesday to Wednesday, if you watch up here, now we're starting to see that Bermuda high weaken and leave, and it kind of splits. A piece of this starts to come over here into the southeast, right? There's that southeastern ridge potential. We still have the North Pacific high, and we're seeing kind of this low pressure system in between out into next week. This is the Canadian prairie precipitation that we were talking about. But with that Bermuda high leaving, it allows this split to develop over into the southeast. And our concern is always if that leaves and the North Pacific high leaves to the Northwest Pacific, this high that almost develops in between in the negative space is going to situate right over here over the middle part of the country. Now, I'm not saying we see that next week. We're really seeing it more so over the southeast, but it's why we watch that Bermuda high signature. You notice when that left, this sea level pressure anomaly started to increase here over the continental U.S. Now, we keep that North Pacific high, thankfully, which allows this low pressure system signature to kind of linger over the middle part of the country. So it's just a different way of almost looking at the same thing, right? That trough ridge pattern, but just looking at the surface reflection of it. We can also look at this in those ECMWF extended forecasts. This takes us all the way out into July. Now, again, we don't put too much weight into individual runs of this forecast, but I'm starting this forecast here in the next 7 days. This is a 7-day precipitation anomaly average. Strong North Pacific high, strong Bermuda high. That's a wet signature over the middle part of the country over the next 7 days. That's why we see the rainfall forecast where it's at. So take the forecast into the future, though. Let's take it out to the end of June. North Pacific high kind of stays put, but that Bermuda high has raced over toward Ireland, and we're seeing that southeast potential ridge development at the end of June. If I take the forecast further, you see that Bermuda high starts to come back to its better position, but we're starting to see that North Pacific high inch further to the northwest at the beginning of July. If I take this all the way further into the middle of July, we start to see that Bermuda high trying to inch back over toward Ireland, that North Pacific high trying to inch toward the Northwest Pacific, and that would allow high pressure system and heat and potential drought concerns to build in the middle part of July. Now, again, I'm not putting too much weight into this forecast. It's the same signature that I showed you yesterday, right, with the MJO starting to head over here toward the Indian Ocean, which we tended to see correlated with drought risk over the middle part of the country. I'm just showing it to you in the form of sea level pressure anomalies. Now, you might be asking, Matt, why this looks like a low pressure system here, this kind of blue contour here. And it technically is. Unfortunately, the reason it's developing here on this model run is because of heat over the central part of the country developing because of a broader ridge here. So we can actually get something called a thermal low over this area of the country. And there's so much heat here only in this one model forecast. Put that caveat on here over Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. The air is rising very quickly. Air rushes in to fill in beneath that, and that is definitionally a low pressure system developing in the models here. So this, despite being a low, is really more of a heat and drought signature, unfortunately, from the ECMWF extended forecast. It's just been kind of attached to that scenario for now. We'll have to see how that updates over the next kind of week or two. Just something to keep an eye on for now. Again, Eric traveling this morning, traded off here. He'll be with you all tomorrow on Thursday morning. If you made it to the end of this video here today, thanks for watching, and I'll talk with you all soon.